Okay, our second lesson is about what we call economic systems. And to get started with that, we're going to take a little bit of a review first of our first lesson so we kind of have a point to start from. So remember, we learned a couple things. First, economics, or I should say economists, study how people make decisions. So that's what economists do, right? And the reason they have to do that is because resources are scarce and human needs and wants are unlimited. So we have lots of things we want, lots of things we need, but there aren't enough resources because resources are scarce to satisfy everyone. So economists have to study how we make decisions based on that. And because there are scarce resources and because we do make choices, we have something called opportunity cost. By the way, just before we go any farther, I want to spend a minute talking about resources since we've already used that term. These are some good vocabulary words to know for the future. First, what is a resource? A resource is something used to produce a good or a service. And we tend to think of resources in a couple different categories. The first one is what's called land. And obviously, we could just think of land as being land, but it's actually a little bit broader than that. Land is defined as natural resources, so it would include things like water, timber, coal, gas, and yes, actual land, land itself. But any natural resource we will classify as land. The second resource we usually think of is what's called labor. And labor is human and animal power. So that could be somebody digging a hole, that could be someone teaching, that could be someone using creativity to think of new ideas. That's all examples of labor. So whatever part that humans and animals contribute, that's considered labor. And then the last one, which sometimes confuses people a little bit, is what's called capital. And capital has a few different definitions, but I'm going to go with what I like the best, which is something that makes other resources more productive. So we have those other two resources, land and labor, but very often we have other things that could make us better, essentially. So if we think of the example of digging a hole, we could dig the hole with our hands. That would be pure labor, but that wouldn't be very productive. We could add a shovel as an example of capital. The shovel is capital. It makes our hands more productive. We could add a lot of capital and add a bulldozer. And now what we're doing is making our human labor much, much, much more productive by using a bulldozer. So land, labor, and capital are the three resources we'll talk about quite often in this course. Okay, back to economic systems. All right, here's the deal. When it comes down to it, folks, because resources are scarce and because humans want lots of things, there is a question that every single society must answer. I call it the question. And it is simply this: how do we allocate scarce resources in the face of unlimited human wants and needs? It doesn't matter what society you come from. It doesn't matter whether you're from Asia or from North America. It doesn't matter whether or not you believe that you have a lot of rich people or a lot of poor people. It doesn't matter. We still have to answer that basic question. Everybody wants unlimited things, so how do we provide for that even though we have scarce resources? The truth is we don't. We have to make choices, but how do we make those choices? All right. Now, every society must try to address that issue by answering what I call the big three questions. So, for example, for whom do we produce? We don't have enough resources to produce for everyone, so who will we produce for? What are we going to produce? We can't produce as much as everyone would like, so what are we going to produce? What are the things we will choose to make? How and how much do we produce? We can't produce as much of everything as we like, so how much in the end will we actually produce? Again, these three questions really are sort of a subset of the big question. Ultimately, all three of these questions have to be answered regardless of what economic system we're talking about. However, we're going to look at two economic systems that answer these questions in very, very different ways. The first one is what's called a free market economy. A free market economy was first at least credited to a gentleman named Adam Smith. You can see his handsome photo right there on the right. Adam Smith wrote very famously one of the most famous works in all of economic history, a book called The Wealth of Nations in 1776, in which he first laid out the ideas of what he termed the free market. And by the way, there are some other names you may see this go by. It's sometimes just generically called capitalism. Um, Oftentimes, you'll also see in social studies classes it's called laissez faire economics. And we'll come back to why it's called laissez faire in just a minute. But here's some basic information to get us started. Smith believed a couple things about people. The first was that humans always act in their own self interest and respond to incentives. Or at least humans always act in what they believe is their self interest and respond to incentives. Humans do things because there's a reason for them to do it that helps them. I often think about that. He was probably right. Even in a situation where you do something truly heroic, let's say something truly selfless, like running into a burning building to rescue somebody, there's still a very good argument to be made that you did that selfishly because you had an incentive to help yourself. If that was somebody that you loved in the building, you were saving them because you would have felt terrible had they been injured. You would have felt terrible. Perhaps somewhere in the back of your head you're thinking about what all the nice things people will say about you for running into that building. Smith believed that ultimately, no matter how much good we did in this world, it was always in our self-interest. And he wanted us to know that because he knew that if we understood that, we would make decisions appropriately. He often referred to something called the invisible hand. We won't get much into that, but what Smith believed ultimately was that the power of self-interest and the power of incentives guided people to make decisions that ultimately help to use our resources in the best possible way. And because he believed that, he believed very firmly that the government should not interfere with the economy, that it was far more efficient if the government stayed out. In fact, the very term in French, laissez-faire, means to leave alone or hands off. He believed the government should not mess with the economy, essentially. Let it be. Let it do its own thing, and ultimately, by doing that, things will work the best. And that's essentially where the name the free market came from, free of government intervention. The opposite of Adam Smith's theories was presented by a gentleman named Karl Marx, and he called them, well, he didn't call it this exactly, but we call it today a command economy. The command economy, again introduced by our friend Karl Marx, was first written about in his famous work, The Communist Manifesto, in 1848. Now, it's nice to know that the reason Marx wrote this was he was right smack in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, where he saw capitalism all around him. And what he saw ultimately was a great deal of gap between those who were very wealthy and those who were not, or what he might have called the haves and the have-nots. By the way, command economies, as I mentioned, very often are called communism. That's not a perfect term, but it often is used synonymously. They're also sometimes called centrally planned economies. So it's good to know the different terms that are there. Okay, so what did Marx ultimately believe? Marx believed a few things. First, that self-interest drove the wealthy to abuse the poor. Ironically, both Smith and Marx believed that self-interest was part of the human condition, that we did things mostly to benefit ourselves. But what he did was look around the Industrial Revolution and saw the wealthy, in his opinion, taking advantage of the poor. And he believed the only way that could be stopped is that if someone stepped in and essentially put a halt to that. And the institution that he thought should do that was the government. It was the government's job to step in and make sure that all of the resources of the society, the natural resources, the labor, the money, was allocated equitably or in an equal way. You can see these are very different things. Adam Smith believed that it should be people making decisions based on self-interest, and that's how resources would be allocated. Marx said very differently, the government must ensure that resources are allocated. The government is the key here. Okay, so let's take a look at the two of them together to kind of compare them. We'll start first with the question of, well, who answers the big questions? Remember we said every society has to answer the questions. Well, who is answering them? Well, in a free market economy, it's ultimately the market, suppliers and demanders. Individual people are answering that question every single day. When you decide to buy a blue shirt versus a red shirt, you're answering in some way the big three questions. When a company decides how many new toys to produce, it's answering one of the big three questions. Marx in communism, or the command economy, said it's the government's job to answer those questions. The reason that they each came to different conclusions about who should answer the questions was because they each had different priorities. Adam Smith's free markets believed that ultimately efficiency and freedom was the best and the most important priority. And that if they did that, the economy will use its resources to create the most gain. And in truth, we've seen that free market societies have traditionally produced, on the whole, by far the most creativity, the most productivity, and the most efficiency, and ultimately the most wealth for a society. And Smith believed the only way that would happen is if there was freedom and efficiency in the market. Marx didn't think that, because what Marx believed was that ultimately the most important thing was that people had equality or equity. He may have even conceded that the free market economy did produce a lot of wealth, but his argument was that that wealth went far too much to a small group of people and not enough to everyone else. So in his view, it was more important that the economy, rather than growing quickly, be equitably distributed amongst the people. Okay, again, take a quick look at this. Free market economy, economic efficiency, positives. What were the positives of this system? Very efficient use of resources, high levels of creativity, vast amounts of wealth. That's why Smith thought it made sense. The negative, as Marx would point out, is that there are those who are left behind. If you don't have the resources to be productive, if you perhaps are handicapped or are perhaps have a stroke of bad luck, in a capitalist society, a pure capitalist society, technically, you would be left behind. And again, Marx noticed this and often made it a criticism of the free market economy. However, command economies have their ups and downs as well. Positively speaking, resources and the fruits of the economy are shared equally, and in a way we tend to think that's a good thing, right? We tend to want people to have an equal amount and to be able to all humans are created equal, right? But the negative side of this is that ultimately it's not efficient because it lacks incentives. There's really no reason for anybody to do better in a communist system. If you think about it, if two guys show up to work every day, one guy sits around eating donuts all day while the other guy works very, very hard, it's hard to imagine that the guy who's working, but at the end of the day, both guys make the same amount of money. It's hard to imagine that the guy who's working very hard is going to keep working very hard for very long. There's no reason for him to work hard. There's no reason for him to produce better things or to be creative or to take risks. So ultimately what happens? There tends to produce lower quality products. And I often point out, communist nations that we still think of kicking around today, or at least in the last 50 or 30 years, the Soviet Union, Cuba, Vietnam, I don't think anybody here has ever bought a Vietnamese or a Cuban or a Soviet TV or Soviet car. Communist societies were not known for producing high quality, and in fact, ultimately, communist societies or command societies, for the most part, would collapse on themselves because of this problem. Okay, and one final point about mixed economies. Mixed economies are really what virtually every economy in the world actually ends up being, even if they lean toward capitalism or lean toward communism. Just briefly, a mixed economy are economies that have elements of both free market and command systems. And if you look at the United States, for example, we are predominantly a free market economy. But we do have command elements. We try to soften the edges of the free market with things, for example, like Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid, public schools, things that ultimately the government helps to, as I said, take the edge off the free market so that those that are left behind aren't completely left behind, while still allowing the free market to produce the wealth that it's known for. And here you go. Here are some good examples I always think of from both in our typical American system. Both examples of free market and command, making it a mixed economy. Okay, this ends lesson 2.